Paul I was the Russian emperor from 1796 to 1801, and he was seen as unpredictable and too pro-German, while the reforms he introduced to the army greatly annoyed his nobles. Thus, he found himself being assassinated by these nobles, and his son Alexander I succeeded him, perhaps most well known for his wars against Napoleon and later role in the post-war world, specifically his leadership of the Reactionary Holy Alliance. Early on in his reign, Alexander I was close to what can be described as an enlightened monarch, sponsoring universities and hoping to liberate the people from serfdom. Yet, the events of the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars would harden the man, move him more towards a more authoritarian position. Then, in 1825, he would pass away, with no sons of his own to succeed him. This wasn't an immediate issue though, as Paul I had many more sons, namely Constantine, Nicholas and Michael. As the eldest, the throne was said to be inherited by Constantine first. But there was a complication. Constantine had been married to a German noblewoman, yet sought a divorce so he could instead marry a low Polish noblewoman he had fallen in love with. Of course, such a thing was quite a controversy in this age, so Tsar Alexander only agreed to the marriage on the condition that Constantine renounce his rights and ambitions on the throne, which he did, never having been the man for grand political ambitions. The heir presumptive thus became Nicholas instead. There was just one issue. Alexander didn't actually bother informing Russia or most of the nobles of this mutual decision. As far as most of the nation and government were concerned, Constantine should be the next Tsar. Upon the passing of Alexander, many amongst the army and nobility were swift to announce their allegiance to Constantine, while Constantine renounced his rights to the throne to his brother Nicholas, who in turn had by this point already pledged loyalty to Constantine. This dynastic chaos was seized upon by the Decembrists, a group that sought to overthrow the absolutist monarchy and install constitutional rule instead. As Nicholas attempted to secure his throne, the Decembrists accused him of stealing it. They would march on the Senate building, hoping to disrupt the ceremony in which the army was switching their loyalty to Nicholas, and perhaps rile more people to their cause, whether military or civilian. A standoff ensued, with the Moscow regiment declaring for Constantine instead. Militarily, Nicholas had the upper hand, but the situation was tense. Miloradovich, acting dictator in service of Nicholas, attempted negotiating with the rebels, but was shot and killed. Civilians began to swell to the Decembrist cause, and fears were rising that Nicholas might yet lose control. Eventually, brute force was used to disperse the protesters, 1,200 dying, mostly civilians, in pursuit of securing Nicholas's throne after a pointless and extremely preventable succession crisis. Now, besides the obvious casualties, the Decembrist Revolt is considered a sad moment in Russian history. A moment where the forces of liberalism were defeated, leading to the generally reactionary rule of Nicholas I, who across his reign would revoke much of Poland's constitutional autonomy, ruling in name of an autocratic, divine monarch, stamping down on liberal movements at home, but elsewhere in Europe too, while getting Russia involved in the relatively disastrous Crimean War. The rule of Nicholas I is generally considered to have been bad for Russia, keeping it stuck in the past at a time when Europe was evolving. This makes the cause of the Decembrists extremely appealing. They wouldn't just sidestep Nicholas I, but replace him with a more liberal form of governing, potentially setting Russia down to the path of political, social and economic reforms far earlier. Yet the question then becomes, could they have actually succeeded? Well, not really. First off, the Decembrist movement was a very broad coalition of different ideologies, at best unified behind the loose concept of a constitution, but just how liberal it would be wasn't even certain. Some went as far as calling for a new republican government, some called for the total abolition of serfdom, some wanted Constantine as constitutional monarch. There was a very real sense of this uncertainty exploding into a second French Revolution. Aside from those points though, most important was that the only man who could give any sort of legitimacy to the revolution was in no way interested in gaining the throne. During the uncertainty after Alexander's death, all Constantine did was iterate his support for Nicholas, even refusing to leave Warsaw for St. Petersburg to help calm the situation, warning the capital that if Alexander's wish for his renouncement of the throne wasn't respected, basically, if they made him emperor against his will, he would retire himself into an even more distant place, practically threatening to leave Russia completely leaderless. Fact is, Constantine had absolutely no intention in fighting his brother for the throne, which puts the Decembrist Revolt into a lot of trouble. Had they succeeded at rallying the people in St. Petersburg and removing Nicholas from the throne, their candidate to replace him would then publicly denounce them, putting Russia in a very dangerous position. So generally, there are two semi-realistic possibilities for a successful Decembrist coup, though take that word with a grain of salt. The first is for them to have military success in St. Petersburg, even without Constantine's approval. The second option is for Constantine to reluctantly take the throne once the revolters kill Nicholas I, thereby leaving Constantine to try and restore order. Though, as you might imagine, this far from guarantees that he supports the liberal revolutionaries who just murdered his brother. I'm sorry for the quick intermission, but by far most of you aren't subscribed. To keep up to date with all the latest releases, consider doing so. Thank you. Now let's start with the first option, where the chaotic situation outside of the Senate Square keeps escalating just like in our timeline, with high-ranking casualties and swelling loyalist and revolution forces. What if a bulk of the soldiers present do switch side to the Decembrists? Even further, a small contingent was scheduled to storm the palace too and try to assassinate Nicholas, thereby ending the greatest obstacle to their rule. A provisional government around St. Petersburg is declared, officially declaring loyalty to Constantine, but in practice coming under the control of Sergei Trubetskoy. The revolution had begun, but it would only be the start of their struggle. Soon, their plans for social and political reforms might be announced, including the liberation of Russia's serfs. It must be noted though that this information would spread extremely slowly. This was Russia in 1825. Infrastructure wasn't great. Beyond that, the information would mostly be restricted to Russia's cities, most peasants being left in the dark to these events taking place. This gives huge advantages to the nobles who opposed this revolution. They would learn of events in the capital and would be far more ready to act. We even saw this in our timeline, where it took the southern Decembrists around Moscow about a week to learn about the events in the capital, by which time it was already way too late. They launched their own half-hearted attempt, only to be defeated and exiled to Siberia as well. News of the coup, however, would soon reach Constantine in Warsaw, and he would be absolutely heartbroken. He had no interest in the crown, and he is very unlikely to sympathize with the figures who murdered his younger brother in his name. He would be swift to disavow and condemn the regime in St. Petersburg, greatly hurting their legitimacy. In fact, it might be possible that Constantine is now convinced to take the crown in this trying time, but he takes position against the revolutionaries. Alternatively, the 27-year-old Mikhail would be the next logical pick, the fourth and youngest son of the late Paul I, as two older brothers are dead and the third has renounced the throne, which would also mean that officially all four of Paul's sons would have been Tsar at some point, which, if nothing else, would be fun trivia. Anyways, either way, the Decembrists would mostly be a military occupation of Russia's capital, and they would have to fight an uphill battle for control over the nation, their opponents having the legitimacy of either Constantine or Michael behind them. One thing that might favor them though, is that the Poles were planning an uprising against Russia, in our timeline launched 5 years later in 1830. This might be expedited, adding further instability to the empire. Depending on if Constantine had by this point left Poland, he could even die in this revolt. Or alternatively, this uprising might force him to take an active stance in the Russian Civil War. However, even in absolutely best case scenarios, where the revolution spreads to Moscow and it is unrealistically and extremely successful, it remains near impossible that they achieve a long-term victory. It is then also important to remember that all of this takes place a mere 10 years after the defeat of Napoleon. Imagine international opinion about such a liberal revolution during this time, especially without the legitimacy of a monarch behind it. As chaos begins to unfold in Russia, Prussia and Austria would both immediately plan military campaigns against the revolutionaries. Even the relatively liberal Britain could never support the murder of a monarch, and while they might back the concept of a constitutional monarchy in principle, events as they are now going on are way too radical. This event would immediately be deemed as just as important, radical and dangerous as the start of the French Revolution. Any Polish revolts get immediately crushed by the German great powers, who themselves feared Polish nationalism in their lands as well, before supporting the Tsar in Russia. No, a liberal, republican Russia in 1825 was not to be. Regardless, that doesn't mean the timeline isn't changed. After all, winning the war doesn't bring Nicholas back from the dead. One of the other candidates thus becomes Tsar, my money being on Tsar Michael II. Yet both options undoubtedly lead to changes to the future of Russia. Let's first start with Constantine. On paper, based on his rule of Poland in our timeline, he could be a bit more liberal than his brother. Even then though, despite him proclaiming to be proud of the Polish constitution, he also very frequently broke it. He was known to be demeaning and violent with his subordinates, while making the classic mistake of most moderate reformers. They reform the system a little bit and then decries everyone who suggests going a little bit further as arrogant traitors, leading Constantine's rule over Poland to be a strange mix between constitutionalism and authoritarianism. Beyond that, we cannot expect he rules Russia as he had Poland. We need to remember, liberal revolutionaries have just killed his brother and forced him to accept a crown he did not seek. More than likely, these events will turn the man more towards autocracy. His rule is unlikely to significantly modernize Russia compared to our timeline. Though, what he might do is prevent Russia's various war in this period against the Ottomans, as Constantine generally disagreed with the expansionist foreign policy of his brother, thereby potentially leaving the Turks in a stronger position across the 19th century. The West thereby, at least temporarily, achieved their desired outcome of having a powerful Ottomans prevent Austrian or Russian expansionism. We then come to the death of Constantine, who in our timeline lacked any legitimate heirs, his only children having come from mistresses. Historically, he died in 1830, as a result of a disease received from fleeing the Polish Revolution. We can easily imagine that he lived a bit longer, but he was already 52 by this point and not in the best of health. It is unlikely that he rules for decades longer. Now it might be possible he does go on to get an heir during this time, but his wife also died in 1831. It is thus possible we get a very young son of Constantine as emperor, but more likely we need to look back at the Russian royal family, with the throne now either passing to Michael, or we move back to Nicholas and enthrone his eldest living son. Tsar Michael we will discuss later, but the other option is Alexander II, who was actually Tsar in our own timeline, edging us dangerously close to little actually changing long term. Yet, Alexander's coming to power a bit earlier could be the biggest change to Russia's internal workings, as despite being an autocrat, in Russian terms he was quite liberal. He reformed the Russian judicial system, reformed the government to be more efficient, cracked down on a few noble privileges, sponsored universities, and most notably, he emancipated the Serbs. After a failed assassination attempt, he would become more conservative, but overall, he is considered quite a good monarch for Russia. Interestingly, much like Constantine, Alexander was a relatively peaceful man, pursuing less extreme territorial goals within Europe, which leads me to believe that this timeline's greatest changes don't necessarily lie within Russia itself, aside from potentially even further entrenching into conservatism from the shock of a monarch being murdered. Rather, the changes may lie primarily in butterfly effects, in preventing the Crimean War, strengthening the Ottoman Empire, and potentially opening up Russia for other ventures. They may even intervene in the Austro-Prussian War, or force Bismarck to do more diplomacy, or in radical cases, even preventing the war completely. But that feels better left to a completely different video. But as mentioned, Tsar Michael might be more likely. But unlike Constantine, we have less evidence about his politics, beliefs, and expansionist ambitions. What we do know, however, is that he and his children were all very sickly, and Michael would spend a lot of time in retreats like in Switzerland in order to recover, and it is easy to imagine that he would be an ineffective ruler, delegating more powers to the nobles of the realm, a precedent which could easily get the nation yet further stuck in the past. Beyond that, as seems to be a theme in this royal family, Michael got no sons in our timeline, meaning that once more, the throne has to pass back to a son of Nicholas, and once more, we'd get Alexander II. In the case that Michael does get a son during this alternate reign, he would be just as sickly, likely absent without strong leadership, and the de facto aristocratic rule would only worsen, again, likely leading to a Russia even more backwards than in our timeline. So, realistically, that is roughly what I would expect to happen if the Decembrists were successful. Or at least, if their success is limited to killing Nicholas and starting an uprising. Rather than achieving a liberal revolution, we might sooner see that the royals, scared, entrench themselves further into conservatism, only setting back Russia in the long term. That said, that is assuming that Constantine either does nothing or opposes the revolution. What if we take the unrealistic route though? What if Constantine is more cooperative with the revolution? Not necessarily agreeing with all of their points, let alone their actions, but for the sake of stability, accepting the throne and potentially negotiating a compromise constitution with the rebels. What if Russia was indeed put on the path of reform decades earlier? Perhaps the best way for this to happen might be the revolution being very successful at the start, while Constantine is indeed forced from Poland by a Polish revolt. Both sides request that he take up the crown, perhaps even joined by calls from the great powers who want to prevent dynastic anarchy and a leaderless, revolutionary Russia. Now don't get me wrong, this would not be Constantine fully embracing the revolution. Rather, we might imagine he calls for an ending to the fighting, accepting to negotiate on a future constitution for Russia, trying to balance the interests of the revolters and the traditional nobles. Essentially, we might see reforms similar but a bit weaker than those of Alexander, but over 30 years earlier. Possible agreements might be a freer press, at least a partial reform of the nation's serf system, a reform of the judiciary, and in extreme cases, maybe even a limited parliament, which of course would be mostly staffed by nobles, but potentially open for very rich commoners. It should be noted that we absolutely do not see the development of a full-on democratic system after this. The nobility is not destroyed and they still dominate the state and the economy. The Decembrists also did not have a coherent plan to develop an industrial state. So, these reforms are merely the start of a longer process which gradually empowers Russia. They don't suddenly turn into the most powerful state in the world within a few decades. Especially because we also have to assume that Constantine and his successors actually respect these reforms in the longer term. These actions then also lead to the Holy Alliance essentially being dissolved, as Prussia and Austria are outraged at Russia's newfound constitution. Real fears spring up in these nations that now the absolutist great powers are outnumbered. There is a low but non-zero chance that the German powers militarily intervene anyways, but Constantine accepting the throne does likely ensure that they don't go quite this far. Beyond that, we would still see the Polish revolt, but even if they are unreasonably successful, this would at worst be ended by German intervention if truly necessary, and then return to Russia in order to not upset the status quo. And Constantine might actually revive Polish autonomy rather than fully crush it following such a revolt. There is then the matter of the Hungarian Revolt of 1848, which seriously threatened to break up the Habsburg Empire, which in our timeline was only decisively broken by Russian intervention. Yet, we absolutely shouldn't expect Russia to now favor the Hungarian Revolution. The Decembrists and Constantine would, at best, be constitutional reformers, and they would still denounce and be opposed to the Jacobin Republican radicalism as seen in Hungary. Beyond that, Russia taking advantage and allowing the Habsburg Empire to collapse would completely destroy the balance of power on the continent, which you might imagine the rest of Europe would not take kindly to. A victory for the status quo for the Habsburgs does remain the most likely outcome. Then we have to contend with the Crimean War, which we may or may not have avoided. It is important to note here though that this war was not merely a Russian power grab against the Ottomans. It started with Napoleon III feeling inadequate and not respected enough amongst his peers. He pressured the Ottomans into making him the protector of Christians, a role traditionally held by Russia. Even in a constitutional system, this would be an outrage amongst the Russian elites. Thus, it is very possible an alternate Crimean War still takes place, but it could easily be viewed as more of a Franco-Russian war, with especially Britain being less paranoid about the intentions of Russia in this timeline. In such a case, it is even possible that the French end up humiliated, with a minor, symbolic Russian victory being achieved. Finally, as alluded to before, the German wars have a minor potential to be changed, as if we remove the Crimean War as it happened in our timeline, we might have likewise improved Austro-Russian relations to such a point Prussia does not risk a war with Austria, as the threat of a simultaneous war with Russia might loom too large. So we could, in extreme scenarios, be steered into a timeline where Germany never reunifies, where Prussia misses this window for unification, failing to take advantage of this temporary period where their military was so superior to their rivals. After all, on paper, all things being equal, Prussia should have been the weakest continental great power. If this indeed happens, the European balance of power would be even further shocked, as arguably, a unified Germany is the only continental state which might be able to match Russia in long-term power. In such a hypothetical, we would have removed Germany and made Russia even more powerful, which is sure to be a terrifying prospect for many in Europe. But of course, this isn't guaranteed. We could easily see Russia and Austria fall out for different reasons, or see Bismarck successfully convince Russia to sit it out, potentially even bribing them with minor territorial gains. This would return us closer to the geopolitics of our timeline and give our Russia some fair competition. Then we once again return to Constantine's inevitable death, and we reach to our trusty succession chart. And once more, we very possibly see either Alexander become Tsar, or Michael and then Alexander anyways. Either way, this is, in my opinion, fantastic news for this alternate Russia. Again, Alexander was already a reformer in our timeline, and where Constantine was a reformer by circumstance, Alexander was one by belief. It is very possible that he would now build yet further liberalization in the nation, empowering the parliament yet further. The reason why a figure like Alexander is so important for Russia is that there is always a risk of a later crackdown on liberalism. Had Nicholas still been alive and returned to power after Constantine, the constitution is far from safe. Alexander could represent the affirmation of the place that liberalism has in Russia, and shows that, even if slow, the noble-dominated society might be on the way out. Now, this doesn't immediately raise Russia to the level of France or Prussia, whether politically or industrially, but the gap is far less extreme. Serfdom is abolished earlier, but the aristocracy still dominates the economy. But if this is combined with relatively low-key foreign policy, the economy is sure to do better. We would eventually see Russia involve itself regarding the Balkans. Even if Constantine and Alexander are not directly expansionist, the declining power of the Turks and the resistance of the Orthodox people in the region would still be a call to action for Russia. But now we reach that annoying point in all scenarios where I start to struggle with predicting any sorts of specifics. The amount of moving parts in this scenario are immense. A lot depends on if Constantine and Alexander do indeed adhere to liberalization. It depends on how and if Russia is still dragged into conflicts with the Turks, and how those are resolved. Still, the overall image should be clear. A more liberalized Russia, hopefully less concerned with conflict within itself, less dominated by an old elite, will undoubtedly translate to more economic progress as well. So, we are going to be very broad and vague for the remainder of this video. Aside from me confidently asserting that Russia is stronger going forwards, the details spiral out of control. If we assume European geopolitics even remotely follows our own timeline, including some form of World War I, then the very fundamentals of the balance of power are already gone. Russia will be far more capable of fighting a protracted war with the Germans, both having more sustainable food and logistics, as well as having a far better war industry. Yet I think there is one crucial question which dominates geopolitics in this timeline. Is Europe now less afraid of Russia due to their constitutional and increasingly democratic regime no longer being the huge, terrifying, autocratic horde of the East? Or is Europe even more afraid of Russia, owing to their increased, greater industry, making the idea of Russia eventually outgrowing all other powers and enveloping Eastern Europe that much more realistic? Even if alliances like that of our timeline do develop, we might easily imagine Britain electing to remain neutral in any conflict that might be, both because of increased confidence in the Franco-Russian ability to withstand the German onslaught, but also because it's more important to ensure that neither side achieves a total victory. Regardless of the timeline we choose to follow, there is serious potential that somewhere in the 1800s we reach that famous cliché about modernizing Russia's in alternate history, them becoming akin to the United States but in Europe. A continental-sized power, democratic but partially decentralized, their sheer size and population ensuring the potential to eclipse all rivals. From here, let us then conclude with two broad conclusions. Though keep in mind, neither are meant as definitive predictions. They are two potentially extreme outcomes, divided between a very positive one for Russia and a very negative one. Starting with the good timeline, this basically assumes that at least in Western Europe, Russia is treated as less of a threat. This would be helped by the founding of Germany, especially once Wilhelm II steers the state towards a belligerent foreign policy, drawing international ire, in contrast to the relatively peaceful foreign policies from Constantine and Alexander, while continual democratization increases respect for the Eastern democracy. Perhaps the empire continues to give autonomy to certain minorities on the same basic principle as Finland and Poland. These autonomies would mostly be regions like the Baltics and the Caucasus, while regions like Belarus and Ukraine likely wouldn't be given the same treatment, as attempts to unify them fully with Russia would continue. In such a best-case scenario, we can imagine the long-term collapse of the Ottoman Empire providing opportunity both for direct expansion, but more importantly, for the liberation and expansion of the Orthodox and Slavic states of the Balkan. Especially if these states model themselves closer to the new Russian model. Likewise, advancing liberalism across the Balkan states, this makes it that much more difficult for the West to defend the Ottoman Empire and paint Russia as scheming, evil autocrats. Beyond that, we need to assume some sort of conflict with the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and preferably Germany too. Perhaps we can assume some sort of previously described conflict in which France and Russia face off against Austria and Germany, with Britain sitting it out on the sidelines. Germany might still start this conflict, likely earlier than in our timeline, fearful of the growing industrialization of Russia, realizing that soon such a war might become completely unwinnable. It is even quite possible that Germany doesn't commit to the Schlieffen Plan, as the risk of Russia invading from the east is that much more terrifying. And honestly, Germany violating Belgian neutrality in this timeline, turning international opinion even further against it, especially from the British, would probably doom any chances of their victory. After a hard-fought conflict, the German powers blink first, and perhaps after some British threats, a ceasefire is announced and the Russians secure their victory. They get to annex minor German territories and through their Polish constituent kingdom expand into Poznan and Galicia, while of course their Balkan allies expand at the expense of Austria. Any such conclusion, through the humbling of Russia's final continental rivals, could mark the start to what might very well become the Russian century. Through a strong constitutional regime, a rapidly developing industry, and the lack of peer competitors, Britain looks on worriedly, as in the West, they are getting eclipsed by the United States, and in Europe, their hegemony is now threatened by Russia. Alternatively, we can imagine some less rosy outcomes for Russia. Their democratic aspects aren't enough to ease minds across Europe. They simply see a strong, developing state and economy which almost has more people than the other four great powers on the continent combined. They simply view Russia in how it affects their own future standing. For London, Russia represents their loss of hegemony over European geopolitics and a threat to influence in the Middle East, China, the Far East, and potentially one day even India. For Austria, even more so than in our timeline, Russia not only encourages Slavic nationalism, but are now also a beacon of democracy and industrialization, making them yet more of an existential threat for the empire. For France and Germany then, the rise of Russia likewise means their own reduction in relevance to a mere second-rate continental power. If we want to, we can maximize this effect by preventing the unification of Germany. Not only does this remove the biggest potential alternate threat to European balance, it also makes France far less sympathetic towards the rising Russian state, as they don't need it as a counterbalance to the Germans. Through their sheer size and potential, even a more liberal Russia could find itself shunned and isolated, eventually facing a coalition of Britain, Prussia, Austria and the Ottomans, likely joined in Asia by the Japanese Empire too. Completely surrounded, their victory in such a case does seem unlikely. Perhaps a good time for such a war is something like 1877, when the situation in the Balkans historically reached a breaking point, and Russia marched all the way down to Constantinople, hoping to gain roughly this for Bulgaria. Perhaps we can imagine Russia being a bit more hesitant to moderate like in our timeline, and rather than negotiate, the great powers call for a more intense Crimean War type conflict as Europe confronts their greatest fear. Now this could lead to all sorts of interesting and wacky timelines, but most crucially, this defeat would not likely see a major revolution within Russia occur, and certainly not a large communist one. Communist revolutions in our history primarily happened in states which were politically and economically backwards for their time period. we saw very few significant communist revolutions in industrial and democratic societies. It is quite possible that Russia is knocked down a peg, but that is it. There might be some reforms, but on the whole, the state and government might very well survive this war despite it being a major defeat. Then in terms of the concluding map, it is of course all vague speculation, but let's create one just for fun. With Prussia so much smaller, they would gain significantly less than what we usually expect from a Germany. Possibly, their focus is directed to the Baltic duchies, which had significant German population, potentially leading to a rather strange Prussian state. Poland could then undoubtedly be liberated from Russia, likely folded into a Habsburg monarchy, quite possibly then extended with their Galician holdings into a new Polish state. Finally, the Ottomans re-solidified their position in the Caucasus and the Balkans, though for how long this will last is debatable. Yet despite how terrible everything seems, assuming the Russians avoid collapse like in our timeline, whether politically or territorially, there is still plenty of room and time for Russia, after these defeats, to rebuild, refrain and bounce back. Whether they will though, I will leave up to you. For now, this is the end of the video. Thank you all for watching and consider leaving a like and a comment as well as subscribing. If you enjoyed this video, click the video on top to watch another in this series. If you've already seen it, I'm sure the bottom video is great too. Once again, thank you all for watching and goodbye.